It's the 2nd of July, 1937, and famed Amelia Earhart is preparing to undertake one of humanity's greatest feats. Prior to the start of the Second World War, she was attempting to be the first woman to circumnavigate the globe. It was planned that she and her navigator were to depart from Oakland, California, and make several pit stops before arriving in Lae, New Guinea, then part of the British Empire. From there, they would refuel at Howland Island and head back to Oakland, completing the journey. Needless to say, they never made it back. After departing from the capital of New Guinea, an optimistic Earhart signals ground stations nearby, and the plane carries on. While approaching the tiny mass of Howland Island, the plane carrying Earhart goes radio silent, and after radar fails to locate Earhart's plane, one of the most perplexing aviation searches in history begins. To start, there were 2 attempts. The first was in March of 1937 and followed a route that began in Oakland before coming to a stop in Hawaii. A botched takeoff resulted in the destruction of Earhart's plane, and thus the operation was called off. Attempt number 2 began nearly immediately after, with her departure from Miami on June the 1st, and made stops in Natal, Brazil, Assab, Ethiopia, Calcutta, India, and Bangkok, Thailand. They then made it to Lae, New Guinea, where after a quick refuel, they were soon to once again depart. Their next and final destination was a small strip of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Howland Island. Patrol boats floated along the way, and the 20-hour-long flight was expected to go as normal. Sometime around 5 p.m., Earhart reported the plane's altitude to be 7,000 feet. They were last spotted near the Nakamano Islands, and at 8:43 in the morning, Amelia Earhart spoke her final words. "We are on the line 157-337, flying north and south." The pair were never heard from again. The flight was to be a treacherous one, with little break and only brief moments of contact to ground. As such, the pair had to choose a suitable aircraft for the voyage, and after much deliberation, ended up with the Lockheed Model 10E Electra. This was a strange choice, as this particular plane was generally a commercial one, not usually suited for voyages of this kind. However, the plane was heavily modified, and the Lockheed Corporation itself assisted in the craft's various alterations. For example, the flight required much more fuel than would regularly be available in an airplane, and so 4 supportive fuel tanks were seated in place behind the cockpit, where passengers normally sat. Behind that, a navigator's post was emplaced, and an autopilot was installed. Towards the very front of the plane, extended radio communications devices, as well as an extended antenna, were stationed. These modifications resulted in the extension of the plane's radio transmission abilities, as well as its maximum fuel capacity. However, they also added roughly 4,500 pounds to the already weighted plane. There's quite a lot of theories out there concerning this particular disappearance, from Japanese plots to fuel consumption to very logical assumptions about aliens and the supernatural. It's quite difficult to reach in and pick one out as fact, but I will do my best. So far in my search, I have chosen a couple of hypotheses that I find the most compelling. The one likely most brought up is that of fuel exhaustion, and it goes a little something like this. Earhart and Noonan take off from Lae and set off for Howland Island. Surrounded by naval ships and other aquatic vessels, they are tracked for many, many hours. Early in flight, Earhart states that they have climbed 3,000 feet to avoid a storm, which would have eaten up much, if not all, of any excess fuel they had in their reserve tanks. The two don't realize this, and by 8 in the morning the next day, the plane runs out of fuel. Earhart glides the plane as far as she can before it crash lands some 400 miles away from their intended destination. Large tracts of ocean and vast distances mean that as many ships as there are in the area, it is simply too much sea to find them. The two passengers are left out in the middle of the ocean for an undetermined amount of time. Their fates left hanging in the balance.
Possibly the most heavily scrutinized aspect of the flight was the plethora of radio transmissions sent to and from Earhart's plane. Like her other flights, her direction, altitude, heading, speed, and fuel readings were all documented in a periodical set of shortwave wireless broadcasts taken in series by the USS Itasca. All of her communications were recorded and were important to the search to some degree, but none have been more investigated as the last recorded radio transmission. There was more than one radio operator aboard the Itasca, and there exist two entirely separate logs of Earhart's radio broadcasts from that day. And on the secondary set of readings, an entry scribbled on the last second reads a questionable sentence, one that has been shrouded in a mystery for years. We are on the line. We are on north, south, north, south, north, south, north, south, north, south. The first thing we must know is the time at which the transmission was sent and received. It occurred sometime after 8:43, the time of the previous radio message. But wait, was this really the last we've ever heard of Earhart? This was the last recorded radio message, and radio operators seem to be communicating with the plane after this last confirmed signal. A note card found aboard the Itasca has scribbles on it, written by press correspondent James Carey, a college student looking for money by working with the Associated Press. On it are several time markings and messages written down as time went on. It states that by 8:20, the plane was out of gas, and they were still in the air by 9 o'clock. The most intriguing thing on the card, however, was the first message. It reads, 8:55, last on. This timestamp seems to indicate that the last time a radio message was received by the crew was 8:55. This might be linked to the message seen earlier. This fact seems to be backed up by the chief radio operator, George Thompson, who later stated that he was in the presence of radio equipment at 8:45. From then on, the radio signals had stopped. This was the so-called official theory, having been endorsed and propagated by the United States government, but the lack of detail and seemingly ordinary happening pushed many to become skeptical of this hypothesis, and another postulate suggests that the two did not crash land in the ocean, and instead, having run out of fuel, chose to head towards the Phoenix Islands, specifically Gardiner Island, before landing in the bay surrounding it. Supporters of this theory call to the 8:43 transmission sent by Earhart, stating that they were on the line 157337. This indicates that if for whatever reason they were unable to find Howland Island, the pair would fly on the northeasterly or southeasterly heading of 157337, a path that directly intersects with Howland Island, but with Gardiner Island as well. Other supporting pieces of evidence include 6 radio messages confirmed to be sent by the Electra. 4 of these described areas near the Phoenix Islands, a set of 8 atolls southwest of Hawaii. Research conducted by Tigar concluded that landing would be very possible on Gardiner Island. A lack of wreckage could be explained by the 4,000-meter drop-off beside the coral reefs, with the plane being swallowed by the ocean during high tide, forever submerged in a watery grave. It's one thing to ask where the plane went down, but a better question is why. Why was the greatest female pilot in the world unable to do what many had done with little struggle? All she had to do was follow the designated path. Disconcerting weather patterns accounted for, they should have had more than enough communication, sight, fuel, and expertise to execute this relatively simple task quite easily. I believe it comes down to two factors. One was Earhart's seeming inexperience with this particular aircraft, both in terms of communication appliances and use of its machinery. It had been stated prior to takeoff that Earhart was not able to take full potential of the aircraft and its newly updated hardware. It was her first twin-engine vehicle and contained special equipment different from other planes she owned. Moreover, she was almost completely unfamiliar with the radio apparati aboard the aircraft, and thus led to a sense of foolishness in her decisions regarding the plane. For one, she removed a 500 kHz antenna from the underside of the plane, a frequency that would have matched with the Itasca's radar equipment, preventing the ship from locating the plane directionally in case of emergency. Fred Noonan also used celestial navigation in his direction of the voyage. This is a relatively unreliable mode of transportation in the open ocean, with light refraction in the atmosphere skewing readings pertaining to the actual positional tracking of stars in the night sky. Small mistakes early in the voyage may have amassed into larger, more perceivable differences. Towards the middle of the voyage, Earhart called into a radio station on Nauru Island, describing a ship she had seen in sight ahead of the plane. Only 2 ships were around Nauru Island at the time of the transmission, and only one of the vessels, the MV Myrtlebank, a commercial ship, verified that a crew member heard or spotted a plane in the night sky at the time. Because the other ship, the USS Ontario, was the waypoint for the plane, it is possible that Earhart began to track the Myrtlebank, slightly distorting the aircraft's flight path, leading to Noonan's subsequent directional bearings becoming increasingly inaccurate, and over the next several hundred miles, the plane would stray further and further away from their intended destination, drifting into the open ocean. A lack of fuel would then cause the plane to go down somewhere in the Pacific, never to be seen again.